Now less than 3 weeks from the official release of the college football playoff rankings. Is Indiana for real, or does a reckoning await, in the words of Pete Thamel? And is it time to hop aboard the coaching carousel? This is the College Game Day podcast for Wednesday, October 16th. Rece Davis and Pete Thamel with you. And Pete, last night, for the first time, eagerly awaited, almost a full calendar year before the college football viewing public, had the pleasure of being able to see college football playoff top 25. A little bit of a different show this year. We only did a half an hour. I sort of liken these shows before the real rankings come out to being like NFL preseason games. You know, you get to experiment with a little bit. One of the things we were experimenting with last night was, okay, how do we reveal the rankings on the bracket? Do you do it a team at a time, which was how we experimented with last night? But I think as we go forward, we may do it, we're going to talk about it this week, but do it, reveal the matchup, and then talk about the rankings. And then probably what I will request that we do is hold the most dramatic for last, which almost every time is going to be the 6-11 matchup. We're kind of looking at it. You do the rankings. Texas, of course, number one. The four teams that would receive the byes would be Texas, Oregon, Miami, and Iowa State. So all of these things just sort of looking at it from an educational standpoint, because I think even as often as fans have heard about the 12-team playoff, they've looked at the bracket and how the bracket would work. Seeing it illustrated is still something that everybody's having to get their heads around.
And I still think for the common fan, the fantasy football playing general sports fan who's like locked into the MLB playoffs right now, they're still going to be surprised when they're like, oh, wait a minute. This is wild. Alabama is hosting a playoff game against Ohio State.
LSU, as it was set up last night. But of course,
Yes.
it wouldn't stay
Yes.
that way. It wouldn't stay that way.
So I was just using a random, just a random example. But there are some matchups where it's like, holy gosh, that is going to be like an unbelievable matchup. The weather is going to come into play when you get some of the Big Ten schools who are going to be locked in on these. So yeah, it's I mean, if we just like took a 30-second timeout, Rece, and like pondered the start of this 12-team era, now that we have like a half a season of empirical evidence. And I think people who listen to this podcast know you and I aren't like hunks for the sport. We'll call a spade when we need to. It's been an unbelievable season. Like, and Saturday was just a frenetic, over caffeinated example of why this has been good. And I don't think either you or I were of the regular season's not going to matter camp. I think you've been very judicious in saying like, when you take something, something goes away, and I appreciate that judiciousness. But the fact that we're discussing Indiana as a playoff team, we're discussing Pitt as a playoff team, like it has all those wonderful 2007 vibes. I remember sitting at the first time I went to Eugene. I was talking about this with some people the other night. I remember sitting in McMenamin's right across from the it's an old brew pub. I think it's still there, right across from the Residence Inn, and watching South Florida lose on a Thursday night. And remember, South Florida and BC were both ranked 2 that first year, and like people in the because Oregon was good. People in the bar were like cheering on South Florida. And it was one of those moments where it's like, oh, this is all kind of connected now. And for how flawed the BCS was, it did like make Boise relevant at Auburn. You know, like it accidentally, right? Unintended consequence of good, but it did nationalize the sport. Now, I'm still of the idea that it is a sport of regional passion that has been nationalized, and it's not the other way around. But I just think like we have all these different pockets of the country that have hope right now. And my wife works in sales a little bit, what she does, and she always says hope is free. And there is a lot of hope right now around the country.
I do think that over the course of time with this system, it is going to return to that regionalization, because you don't have to worry so much about what Boise's doing if you're Auburn. However, what's happened because of conference realignment, particularly in the Big Ten, is that the regionalization has become national, as evidenced by last Saturday night with Ohio State and Oregon. I mean, that's a regional, I'm using air quotes if you're not watching because it is a conference game, but time zone wise, geographically, that's a national game. And I think for people viewing at home, that was a national game. And so that's something else that people have to get used to. I think that one of the things as we look at this from a ranking standpoint, and we used the AP rankings last night to fill out that bracket, is the idea in terms of hope. When we used the rankings, we used one of the touch screens and it had the all-state playoff predictor, which I don't know quite what to make of that. But one of the interesting, yeah, I mean, well, okay, so it's 62%. It's this sport's so unpredictable. I think having a playoff predictor is kind of difficult. But one of the things that was obvious, that even with the mathematical equations, as you scroll down, and there was a button you could hit on the touch screen that said, if they went out, what's their chance of getting in? And you're getting down to Pitt. And it's like, well, 99.9, which it doesn't show 100. Pitt wins out. That means they win all their games. They win the ACC. And it's the same thing with Indiana in the Big Ten.
You mentioned Texas Tech in one of our internal notes this
Yeah.
week. Like,
People have forgotten about Texas Tech completely, including me. Not forgotten, but like said, oh, and you go look and you remind yourself every week they're unbeaten in Big 12 play. If memory serves, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but the game they lost to Washington State, the game they didn't have Taj Brooks.
Correct, they did not. Yeah, he came back the next week. Yeah, he's an elite tailback. Yeah,
yeah.
Yes.
So they lost one game without their best player. So they're a force in the Big 12, and there's probably not an avenue for them. But Washington State sits here now, not with a conference affiliation, so to speak, at the moment, and their only loss is to Boise State. It's who is in the mix. So there is hope across the fruited plain for sure.
Yeah, and that's it's just when we look at the slate this week and we look ahead to election night when we get the rankings for real for the first time from the committee, it's really going to be fascinating. One of the little nuances that's emerged so far that I've just generally been appreciative of is that those who played the early season blockbuster non-conference games have not been punitively punished, meaning like LSU is still in the mix. And a two-loss LSU team, depending on who the next loss would be to, could still make the playoff. Even though they played USC. Like my fear as a fan, and obviously we say this all the time, we root for the sport. We want good games, right? We don't care who wins, but we want the sport to be healthy and we want great matchups, which everybody wants, right? And the fear is, and you saw some of the rhetoric out of Nashville, Rece, from Tony Petitti, the Big Ten commissioner, Greg Sankey, the SEC commissioner, about the onus that's going to be on this particular college football playoff committee. Because the judgments they make and the decisions they make when they get to the fine points of who gets in, we're going to say the 10th and 11th spot, assuming the group of five team gets the 12th spot, which isn't automatic, but it is likely. Those decisions are going to like reverberate from sea to shining sea in terms of how you schedule non-conference, how the whole playoff format looks going forward. I just think there's going to be a lot of like big decisions that are going to be based off of very small sample size.
Heather Dinich last night on the show brought up a very valid point that, let's say Ohio State were to lose another road game at Penn State, for instance, and then Ohio State finds itself in a resume position, much like Alabama's 2 years ago, in which they're pointing to the two best things on their resume being close losses, depending on what else happens with Indiana, obviously, and if Michigan gets its act together. But and she brought up this idea of the non-conference schedule, which I think is the way a lot of people look at it. I would strongly encourage the committee to remove that from their vernacular. Take the schedule as a whole. And here's the reason I say this, Pete, is because The schedule as a whole is what should be evaluated because the schedules within the conferences are no longer the same. And at this point in time, they're not even close to the same in some cases. So take Ohio State's schedule as a whole. Did they play a difficult enough schedule across the 12 games? Okay, so those three weren't so great. Well, you also have somebody that might have played a good non-conference game that also, by the luck of the draw, got an easier in-conference slate, whether Big Ten or any place else. So I'm hoping they sort of remove that. I know they want to encourage non-conference scheduling, but the way to do that, in my judgment, is to evaluate the schedule in its entirety and reward the people who have done this. For instance, reward Georgia for playing Clemson and Georgia Ohio State comparisons. If they say both were to wind up in the same boat with two conference losses, if the Dogs were to lose to Texas this weekend in another close game, um, Georgia's schedule within the SEC is in no way comparable to Texas A&M's schedule within the SEC. It is far more difficult. So you have to evaluate the things as a whole. And Ohio State, its schedule in its entirety, probably not as tough as some, but at least two behemoth road games. I mean, one you lose by 1 point, and I'm not saying they're going to lose to Penn State, but for sake of this discussion, that's what you're talking about. And one would assume nobody is going to go against that team in scarlet and gray and blow them out. So if they were to lose another game, it will be a tight last minute affair. So I hope that there's not this emphasis on, well, okay, for whatever reason, your non-conference this year didn't work out this way. But if you do play those games, I hope it's reward as opposed to penalty, and looking at the schedule in its entirety.
Yeah, it's almost like quad one wins, right? Like if I look at this Ohio State schedule quick here, assume they beat Michigan, Indiana is probably a borderline quad one win, and then Nebraska and Iowa would give them four, which if you did Georgia quickly here, and assuming they're a two-loss Georgia, let's say they lose as the odd makers predict this weekend, they would obviously have the Clemson win. I don't know if we count Kentucky in there.
I don't think so. That's probably
Yeah.
that feels like, even though I've got all kinds of problems with the quad system in basketball, Kentucky feels quad too. Although on the road, because you get a wider berth on there, maybe it's
Why don't
borderline,
we
but
give them
not
a
quad
half
two.
for Auburn and a half for Kentucky? So we'll call
All
it
right.
two. And then Ole Miss would be three, Tennessee would be four. You got Georgia Tech in Florida. Like, that'd be a pretty good debate. Like that, you could go in circles on that one for a while. That could fill up some talk radio in Atlanta and Columbus, if we're sitting there on the Saturday night, heading into the selection.
I'm of the opinion, though, just because I know Ohio State fans have a tendency, I know this may come as a shock to you, and not all of them. I shouldn't cast such a wide net, but I would say a significant portion of Ohio State fans can be hypersensitive and overreact. So let me point this out. I think even if they were to lose at Penn State and not go to the Big Ten championship game, if they win the rest of their games and avoid some ugly loss, I don't foresee a situation in which they're not, in the playoff. They are clearly one of the best teams in the country, and I wouldn't even say one of the 12 best. They still, to me, I'm waiting to see if Georgia reestablishes itself in this group. But to me, the three teams atop the rankings or ranked highly that have created a little separation in my judgment to my eye test: Texas, Oregon, and Ohio State. They're the three to me, and maybe Georgia. I thought Georgia was in that group before the season. I suspect they're going to prove to be on Saturday night. I don't think Georgia has played to its potential, especially defensively up to this point. But if they play to their potential, there's no question that they're in that group, and maybe there are four of them. And I'm not sure that there's anyone else there with them. We'll find out if Miami is, but the two escapes with Miami, that doesn't lend itself to thinking that they're in that ethereal realm. Penn State, had an escape against SC, good win, road, two time zones, all that. They also had, a couple of semi struggles in earlier games, against Bowling Green, who is pretty good. Everybody struggles with them, it seems. So, those are the three and probably four that I think have separated from the others a little bit. So if those two were to lose a second game, I just can't conceive, absent other losses. A third game brings something else into the equation, but you lose a couple with those two teams, it's hard for me to see a world in which they still aren't in the playoffs someplace.
Yeah. Well, nobody knows the playoff better than you. Nobody's done more live television about the playoff. Yes or no question. Does a three-loss team get in the first edition of the 12-team college football playoff?
I've been saying all offseason and up till now, yes, because I thought, as has been the wrongest of wrong predictions ever, when I pulled Kansas out from the Big 12, I thought the three-loss team would come from the Big 12. And so I thought for sure. Now I'm going to say, Pete, I'm going to say no, because I don't think Iowa State or BYU will get to three losses. Texas Tech could. I mean, that could be the caveat, because they've already lost a non-conference game. They could still dump a couple of conference games, find their way into the conference title game, and then win it. So that wouldn't, so in that scenario maybe, but I'll say no since you said yes or no.
Okay. All right. No, that's
But
that's
barely,
fair.
barely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My anonymous scouts who said Florida State will have the best defensive line in the country takes your Kansas call to win the Big 12 and challenges them for the worst call of the year.
Hey, that's why we love. You know what? The poor our friend Lance Leipold, who's an excellent coach. Sometimes things go this way, man. I mean, they've had a bunch of leads in the second half, and they can't finish games. And Jalen Daniels coming off the injury from last year, turned
He's
the
actually
ball
starting to
over.
play better. It's like
Yeah,
but
they'll
oof.
probably get somebody before the end because they're
Oh
better
yeah.
than they
Oh
played.
yeah. No, I mean, it's not like they're getting blown off the field here. Yeah, no, that I can only imagine. But that's the beauty of this Big 12, right? Like a team you thought would be 5-1 is 1-5. And like the a bunch of coin flips that then Texas Tech has won a couple wild games at the end. Cincinnati and Arizona come to mind off the top of my head. Like that league has been wonderfully bananas. And that's like as we sort of build college football into this like big brand monolith, right? Like some of the magic is that at like after the Alabama Georgia comeback, you flip to the end of Cincinnati Texas Tech, and it's like bananas for the last 3 minutes, right? Like that's the sport that I think you and I fell in love with, right, Rece? Like that's the like it's just not these singular huge games. It's just sort of the chaos everywhere. And we're gonna talk about Indiana a little later. We can maybe dive into this a little more, but I do think the way they epitomize to me the way the system has evolved in Vanderbilt, right? Like the two sort of glaring examples of bottom feeders becoming relevant is the way the system has evolved. The bottom feeders are going to be better because they can bring in 20 players from the portal who are very good football players, and that doesn't mean you can go make the playoff, but boy sure as heck means you can compete in your league now and be very very good.
As we turn our attention to Indiana a little bit in a big game against Nebraska this weekend, I want to have one more point about the rankings. And as I look at this, the team that would be at the moment, if you use CAP, the first team out, and it's Notre Dame. Notre Dame is ranked 12th in the AP poll. They had what in the past would be a loss that I would almost deem a disqualifying loss to a team from the MAC in Northern Illinois. Good team, but in the old days, that probably just about disqualifies you. And even so, it's still left, as I tout this idea of making sure you look at the schedule in its entirety. Early on, after that loss, we looked at Notre Dame's schedule and said, oh no, from their perspective. Florida State's not good, not what they expected to be. So that game in November no longer carries a lot of weight for Notre Dame. USC's lost game. Oh no, that game no longer carries a lot of weight for Notre Dame. How are they going to offset this? Well, now as you get to mid October, Notre Dame still has two undefeated teams left to play, undefeated at this moment in Army and Navy, both of whom are ranked at the same time for the first time since 1960. Quick quiz. I know you know the answer. 1960, who won the Heisman Trophy?
Was it Doc Blanchard?
It was that was he was like about 14 years before, I think.
Okay.
Joe Bellino from Navy.
Joe
So
Bellino from
Navy,
Navy.
Army ranked. This
Wrong
was like
academy.
pre-Staubach.
Yeah.
How about that? Between 60 and 63, Navy won
Yeah.
two Heisman trophies because Staubach won it
Yeah.
in 63. But now you have Army, Navy, both ranked, both in playoff contention because both are leading the American. Army's got a chance to go 6-0 in conference play this weekend because of the way their schedule is stacked up with only two conference games left. You
Yeah.
know?
No, and the notion of those two playing in the AAC title game and then playing again is is real wild and yeah, I'd be curious how people in the AAC feel about that, right? Now Navy beat Memphis, right? Does Army play Memphis, Reese?
Army does not get Memphis. They play East Carolina this week, and then Army has their challenging game will be North Texas, who is in that. And I think if memory serves, they have UTSA.
They do.
I
Who's
believe
not
that's
what they
right.
were.
Right. So those are the two. There's pretty easily a world in which Army could split those games, assuming they get past East Carolina this week. But Army's leading the nation of running for 370 yards per game, and Navy's added a different component to its offense, which, by the way, Nick Saban's going to break down in the film room this week. Well, still dive option.
I think Bill Belichick will be tuned in for Nick Saban on Navy's offense.
Oh, you know what? That's a great point. That's a great point. Belichick loves him some Navy football.
Oh, like loves him some
Yeah.
Navy football.
It's still one of the more. It was a terrible situation because it was an empty stadium. But the game during the COVID year that Herb Street and I called at the Naval Academy with no one in the stadium
Is that BYU?
against BYU, and BYU sort of slobber knocked them.
Yeah,
And
Zach Wilson.
yeah, and Bill Belichick came on, and I've told this story before. We were hoping just to get a couple of questions about Navy football because they were about to start the season. And he stayed on, I want to say the better part of a quarter, and maybe through a commercial break, and was unbelievable, as we've now seen on TV, just how good he is. Let's talk a little bit about Indiana on the subject of hope, Pete. This Hoosiers team, and what a great job Curt Cignetti, Mike Shanahan, their entire staff, Dantino Sinceri. Cignetti is like 90 games over 500 as a head coach in his entire career. Brought in 27 transfers, 21 of them had 3 or more years of college football experience. And this is the second best start at 6-0 in Indiana football history yet. And I'm not trying to rain on the parade because, as you and I talked about just before we started recording, it's Indiana. Winning games against anybody should be celebrated because they haven't done that very often in their history. But Nebraska on Saturday is going to be the first opponent that the Hoosiers have faced currently holding a winning record. Their opponents are a combined 14-23. Their strength of schedule ranks 112th. It's actually better than Nebraska's overall in terms of strength of schedule, but Nebraska's played, a couple of solid teams in Illinois and Colorado. So Huskers can become bowl eligible for the first time since 2016, but the story is Indiana on homecoming. Cignetti says he thinks they have the right mindset and culture to stay in this thing until the end.
Yeah, so we'll do a little story time, Reese. February, I went over to the NFL Combine, as I always do, to do draft prep for us, and ventured over one afternoon to Bloomington to see Curt. We had obviously done game day there last year, got to know him some, and I wrote a little story / Q&A with him, and the two things stood out. One is at one point I used the restroom in his office and was washing my hands, and I looked down and he had a toothpaste on his counter from Tom's of Maine. Have you ever heard of the brand of toothpaste, Tom's of Maine? Yeah. So on the toothpaste, as I'm washing my hands, I look down. It says, "Wake up, brush teeth, make change." So I kind of walked out of the bathroom chuckling, and I said, "You get some motivation from your toothpaste?" He's like, "What are you talking about?" I was like, "Your toothpaste. It says, 'Wake up, brush teeth, make change.'" He goes, I've used that thing for years and I've had no idea it says that. So I use that as the little device in my story because like to do that at Indiana, you have to make change. And Indiana, I learned has more losses than any program in major college football. The coach's wing of the facility is named after Bill Mallory, who has a losing record. And there was a long, long way to go. And what Curt Cignetti did would be difficult to just replicate because I believe he took 11 players from JMU. He might have taken an additional one after the spring, but when I was there, it was 10 or 11. And
I've got 13, but the
you got
point's
13.
the same.
Okay.
The point's
Yes.
the same. Yeah.
It's, and then a bunch of staff. So if you go take 20 guys from the portal, it can, I call it portal roulette. It can work and then it can backfire spectacularly. And we've seen plenty of examples of both of those, sometimes within the same program, like year after year. But the calculus of Curt Cignetti was that he knew the players he was getting. He knew they fit in his system. He knew how they played. So getting them from the basement to being solid was what he traversed. And in the meantime, he recruited John Mellencamp to play a concert for it was like 10,000 a head or something to raise NIL money. He went out and I remember one of the first things I said to him when I turned the recorder on in his office, I was like, well, why can this be done here? And he stood up and he said, why can't it be done, Pete? And I was like, whoa. Okay. And the line I used in my story and a couple of his staff members texted me after, because I used it more than once, was Curt Cignetti has an unflappable belief in Curt Cignetti.
Mm-hmm.
And
that was a great line, by the way. That's a great line.
It is, if you've met him, it is a compliment. He carries himself with an aura of unflinching belief, and that permeates through the program. So the last thought here, and we can bounce back and forth some. I don't want to go on a monologue. So I talked to some scouts. I'm going to do something on game day on Saturday about Indiana, and you're like, okay, they have all these veteran guys. You just mentioned the statistic. So I said to a scout, I said, how many guys did you write up? Meaning veteran starters, draft eligible guys, just like we have to have a report on this guy. And he said more than 20. And I was like, wow. Because I think they only have two sophomores on the two deep that I saw. One of them is a very good corner who came late from JMU, Pons. And then I said, well, how many guys will get invited to the combine? And he goes, probably one, Curtis Rourke. So yeah. They're doing this they got old, right? We've seen that formula in college basketball, right? They got old, they got sound. They did bring in a very good quarterback in Curtis Rourke, who was excellent at Ohio. He had some knee injuries, but he was excellent there. And then now Surratt could get drafted down the road. He's only a junior, and Aiden Fisher is their very productive linebacker. Both those guys came from JMU. They're probably the best players other than the quarterback on both sides of those balls. Pons too. But they just basically said, we're going to get really solid, sound football players who are bought in, and the culture has changed. So the unflappable belief of waking up, brushing teeth, and making change has occurred.
Aiden Fisher is going to wear a mic for us and be part of the Indiana segment. He'll be mic'd up this week, wearing a mic during practice this week. Looking forward to that. I was glad they did that. I think Curt decided he didn't want to share the speech, which a number of coaches do, and that's certainly a coach's prerogative. There are coaches who don't mind it, especially in this age of everything sort of being out there, and there are others who view that more as a private time with the team. But the thing that I appreciated as the host of College Game Day was that they were open to alternatives. And so it's great. I love hearing from the players because the coaches, generally speaking, are the constants in the sport, and hearing from the players gives you a different insight. So I'm looking forward to what Aiden has to say to the Hoosier defense, which is going to have its hands full against Dylan Raiola and Nebraska. What's your gut on this? It's homecoming at Indiana. Rourke's coming off Big Ten Offensive Player of the Week. He's had 3 Big Ten games with 3 or more touchdown passes. First time that's happened for a Hoosier since 1967, which was the best start in school history. They started 8-0. What do you think? Is this the week? And Nebraska, by the way, I know Indiana can pitch it around. Nebraska, the only team in the country that has yet to allow a rushing touchdown.
Wow. Good for Tony White in that defense. I did not know that. I did not know that stat. So Indiana's defense, I talked to a couple coaches on each side of the ball who's played them this year, has been bend but don't break. Right? They've given up some yards. They play off you. They're like take the 5 yard run, take the 5 yard run, and they wait for the modern college offensive coordinator to get impatient, which the modern college offensive coordinator usually does. They don't give you. I'd be curious if we could get Marissa Dowling, our ace researcher. I asked her about age to see if she could look something up because I would just think looking at their roster, they have to be one of the oldest teams in the country, one of the most experienced teams in the country, and there's different metrics to gauge that. My hunch is Nebraska will have the patience and they have the personnel. Look, Indiana hasn't faced a good quarterback yet. That's really like one of the things this comes down to. So, how do you finish drives? How do you take the bend that don't break and break them? You have some precision at that position, and you have some options at that position to do that. I don't think Nebraska is going to go in and win 62-0. I want to be clear about that, but I do think they are of a different class of talent, especially at the quarterback position, than Indiana has seen. Now, would it be a heck of a scene? I was at one of the bigger Indiana home games in recent years, coming off the COVID year when they were excellent with Michael Penix. They hosted Cincinnati, the Cincinnati team that went to the playoff in week 2 or 3 that season. I was doing all access story of Cincinnati, and like I had never been to a football game at Indiana. It had some juice, Rece. Like it was like, oh, okay, like the sideline is very close to the student section. And I just remember it was like rowdy. There was some passion there. Certainly, people at Indiana care about sports, right? They care about their school. Um, Cignetti hit me with a bunch of the alumni numbers. I mean, they have as very close to as many living alumni as anyone in the country. So you throw homecoming in, you throw sort of a historic. It's the breakthroughs are always the most fun for me, right? The first time a team makes the NCAA tournament, the first time a team is marching towards a play, like those are what gets the bandwagon full. Yeah, so I'm not going to be some kind of wet blanket and sit here and say I don't think Indiana is going to compete in the game, but I do think that they will struggle to move the ball against that defense that's number 7 in the country in rush defense, number 13 in total defense, number 7 in scoring defense. Like Nebraska has done a good job shutting teams down, and it may look a little bit like an NFL game, which I think Matt Rule will be comfortable playing and winning like a bit of a mud fight.
You know, I think everyone is expecting it to come crashing back to earth. And I'm not sure which way I'm going to go on this game because I'm pretty high on Indiana, as you know. I think mostly because, and I keep using this adjective, they're crisp. They don't, they look as if they know what they're doing. They've got, Curtis Rourke has been around a really long time. You've got veteran quarterback at home against uber talented, but freshman quarterback on the road. I think it'll probably come down to whether Indiana's defense, can make some plays, can force Nebraska into some mistakes. But this is a really entertaining matchup Saturday between two teams on the rise. And wait till you hear, speaking of not facing elite quarterbacks, I got a little something for you in the marquee game of the week, but it might alter the way you look at Texas and Georgia. That is what is known as a tease. It's getting mid-season now, Pete. Coaching carousel. We spent a lot of time talking about Indiana. It would appear early returns and certainly his resume would appear that Indiana got it right. You have pointed out that we haven't seen the rash of mid-season dismissals, departures that we have in recent years, and a number of reasons for that. Coaching carousel. What's percolating out there right now?
So let's just do a little flashback here to 2022. By this time of year in 2022, we had Scott Frost fired, Herm Edwards fired, we'd had Jeff Collins fired, Carl Durrell fired, Paul Christ fired, and Brian Harsin was not fired yet. So that's 5 firings. Brian Harsin was not fired yet, but he was pretty much fired at this point. So in by Halloween, Harsin was Harsin was dismissed. So I bring all those up to say that was not a long time ago, right? That was essentially 2 years ago. And the world has changed so much that we've had no in-season firings yet. And the reasons are the reasons the sport has changed, right? People don't want the roster to flee. They want guys to go to the portal. They don't want guys to just quit. And certainly, like after Florida loses to A&M and there's this big furor, well, DJ Lagway can just take a red shirt and go in the portal and go to the next bidder if you if he doesn't like the way things are going. So we've seen some of that. I think Rece, from the big picture in this coaching carousel, what we've expected to happen is trending towards happening, right? Like I think the Florida job is still expected to open. Billy Napier maybe had a chance on Saturday to try to turn that. Few chances, quite frankly, and just didn't happen. The Baylor job is obviously still trending towards opening. The two that probably weren't discussed heavily going into the season that have emerged as possibilities now are North Carolina and Purdue. North Carolina seems more certain. They've lost four in a row. They gave up 70 to James Madison. Mac Brown just seems like a little bit rattled. I do think they'll hold hands on that exit. That's not going to be like a fiery escort you out of the office with security dismissal like we saw with Robert Saleh and the Jets. But it just seems like that's trending towards some kind of ending. It would be a surprise to me, and I think to you probably, if Mac Brown is a coach at North Carolina next year. And then, is that fair?
Oh, 100%. And, you know, sometimes you look at things and you mentioned Jeff Collins, and Jeff Collins had a role on Saturday in North Carolina's latest loss. You know, he desperately wanted to beat Georgia Tech. North Carolina had gotten back in the game, looked as if they were going for overtime in his defense. Now the defensive coordinator at North Carolina, allowed Jamal Haynes to go 68 yards right up the middle with 16 seconds left in the game to win the game. So you you name you name the type of losses, and I'll tell you the other. I don't know that this is going to open, but sometimes the types of losses that frustrate, exasperate, or infuriate fan bases. North Carolina has had them. West Virginia has had them. Losing rivalry games, losing big opportunities at getbacks, all those kinds of things. I'm not suggesting that's going to be one that opens, but maybe it will. But
I wouldn't
sometimes
think so, but yeah.
sometimes the momentum starts going against you. As we talk about the coaching changes and stuff, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out the sadness and the heartbreak around the North Carolina program. They lost Tylee Kraft, who had a battle with lung cancer, and had the game dedicated to him on Saturday. This has been an emotional time for everybody in the Tar Heel family, and our prayers and condolences continue to be with him. And you understand perspective and scope of things in terms of the real world versus this. But I agree, even someone as accomplished and who has won as much at the highest of highs, from Mac Brown, national
Mhm.
championship coach, Hall of Fame coach. When the momentum starts going against you, particularly late in your career, it's difficult. But I agree. If indeed that's what happens, and if indeed there's a change made, it will be amicable, and it will be, he is a part of that North Carolina family. If you've been around that, he is a guy who is very important, to the Tar Heels, and he'll be, that'll be handled in such a way as Mac and Bubba Cunningham and everybody at Carolina sees fit. The Billy Napier thing is interesting to me, Pete, because it looked like a done deal. For a while Saturday night in Knoxville, you said, you know what? Because first of all, I want to give credit to the Gators and to Billy and his staff. I think Florida is still playing hard. And I didn't know if I felt that when they played Miami in the first game. But maybe that was frustration, because sometimes with teams, frustration can make you appear that you're not playing as hard as you ought to. I think Florida's still playing hard, and that's to their credit. I think that I would have felt better about the whole thing if he'd tried to win it when he had a chance to win it. Go for two, try to win the thing, win or lose. If you lose, so what? You've already dumped some games. Just do it right now. And that was an opportunity, I think, to win or lose. Now, there would have been criticism if he had lost for sure, but it was a chance to sort of give a bolt of energy through the program. There was a huge reward and didn't seem to be a ton of risk with it. And now you're sort of back to the malaise feel, despite the fact they played really well against a good team Saturday night, and there's still more ball to play. Maybe they'll build on it. I hope they do. I really like Billy Napier. I'm surprised that it hasn't gone better at Florida up to this point. And I think he's a good coach. And I think whether it is at Florida, if they ride through this storm, or if he gets another chance someplace else, I think he's going to win because I think he's a good coach. But for whatever reason, it just hasn't gotten going, in Gainesville, and it's frustrating to them, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I think back to 12 men on the field for the field goal at the end of the first half there. And you think back to that not being the first time that's been an issue for them. It's just those. It just you use the word crisp to talk about Indiana and clean. It just hasn't been crisp and clean there, you know. And when your roster is good but not great, like and the margins are thin in the SEC, it just has to be tighter than that. I agree with you, Reese. I'm not an always go for two guy, but in that chance, when you need a lightning bolt to save your job, right? Like simply put, everybody knows Billy Napier. There's inevitability around his firing. If you want a thunderclap to energize your program, your fan
And
base, like
change it, maybe. Yeah.
yes, yeah, like you need a momentum shift, like clean and simple. And that offered, that the opportunity, by the way, by playing really well for 60 minutes, right? Or 50, like you had earned the opportunity for a momentum change. Because I don't think that program is untalented. I don't think they're personnel wise completely overmatched. I do think that with some cohesiveness and some, just a little bit more crispness, like you say, they could compete down the stretch here. So um I think the other thing we're seeing, Reese, with these big leagues now is inevitably you grow to 18 in the Big Ten. Somebody's coming in 18th, right? That looks like UCLA. Martin Jarman had some quotes, the athletic director there in the LA Times today saying that Deshaun Foster is safe. And Deshaun Foster was handed a terrible situation. He got the job late when Chip Kelly left for Ohio State. The roster was gutted. More guys fled after that. And they don't have one of the reasons they hired Deshaun Foster is they didn't have the resources to go spend $8 million on an established coach. So, and they don't have great NIL. So you are getting administratively from the campus side, not the athletic department side, you are getting what you paid for here. And I do think like there's a certain visceral reaction to finishing at the bottom of these leagues because they're so big now. I think one of the interesting litmuses will be Purdue. They've really struggled in year two under Ryan Walters. It would cost, more than $9 million to buy him out, never mind the rest of the staff and everything that would go with it. And I think they need a strong finish or he's going to end up in the crosshairs too, Reese. It's just they fired OC Graham Harrell. That didn't seem to help. There were reports he was calling the offensive plays the other night. Like it just seems like that is difficult. But again, you want to go back to administration. Purdue's best offensive player coming into this season should have been Deion Burks. He's now Oklahoma's best offensive player. Their best defensive player was Nick Scorton. He's now Texas A&M's best defensive player. Scorton will be a first-round pick. Burks is probably a top 50 guy. He's been banged up a little this year, so we haven't seen him as much. But like, if you are going to go and compete at these high levels, you need to be able to make offers, and they could not financially compete to keep those caliber of players. So, go ahead.
So let's be consistent here, though,
Yeah.
Pete. With Billy Napier, we said you need that lightning bolt. Give Ryan Walters this. He tried for the lightning bolt Saturday against Illinois. If people didn't follow that game, in the third quarter of that game, Illinois had a 27-3 lead. Whoever called the plays from that point forward for Purdue, it worked out really well. They got it to overtime, tied at 43. Then Illinois scored to go at 50-43. Purdue scored. They went for two. They didn't get it. So, I still applaud the decision as I would have with Napier. So maybe and the other thing with a program like Purdue, and I understand the reaction, and it probably is infuriating to look across the state and see Indiana, first year new coach, and getting all of this attention. But are you going to do it again? Are
Yeah.
you really do you really lack that much confidence in the decision that you made 2 years ago? Or are you going to stick with the guy? And as for Deshaun Foster at UCLA, because of all the reasons you mentioned, this to me is more of a classical, old school, long-term rebuild, and you ought to ride with him on it. Let's find out. Let's find out if Deshaun Foster is a good head coach. Let's find out if he can build the program, because you didn't hand him the keys to a Lamborghini. You handed him the keys in a beautiful garage. Let's make no mistake about that. A beautiful, spectacular garage in Westwood, but the car itself is a jalopy in need of transmission and overhaul. And so you've got to give him time to get the parts together and see if he can build it to get the thing back on track. That would be the worst thing UCLA could do, in my judgment.
100%.
Again, I mean, I can't imagine how foolish that would be. And I'm almost there with Purdue. Purdue is not playing nearly as well as most thought, and that's fair criticism. But boy, you keep churning. Saban said this on the show a couple of weeks ago, and it applies to Napier. Now, there are on-the-field issues that you have rightly and fairly pointed out with the Gators. But it is also true what Nick said on the show, that if you keep going through coaches that all of whom were good and now they're not, when they get to you, maybe it's not just the coaches. You know, I mean, rare is the person in any business who can overcome bad structure, bad organization around them, who through force of nature can change all of that, because a lot of those things are built into the DNA of programs for years and years and years, and usurping the power away from them usually takes a near catastrophic set of circumstances. Go back and use Saban again. For years after Bear Bryant, there was sort of a power structure unwilling to yield to whoever the coach was, and numerous examples where there's Bill Curry or Dennis Franchione, both of whom won 10 games. So did Mike Shula, but once it got to the end of the Mike Shula era, they were in dire straits. So then you have someone of Nick Saban's pedigree, force, leadership. He can come in and make the changes necessary, and everybody's going to get in line. Deshaun Foster doesn't have that type of equity yet, so you've got to let him try to and won't for 20 years, Nick Saban type of equity if things go perfectly. But you've got to let him try to build. You got to let Ryan Walters try to build it if you hire them. Show some confidence in your decision, unless things get so unwieldy from an organizational standpoint that it appears to be beyond repair. That's a different situation. If the guy is over his head, nothing is working, he appears overwhelmed, that's different. And you have to be in there day to day to make sure you know that. So,
do you know who UCLA's quarterback commit is for the class of 2025?
I don't.
It is Madden Iamaleava, brother of Nico.
Oh, yeah.
Top 100
and how
commit.
Does he compare? How does he compare as a prospect?
I think he compares really favorably. ESPN has him as number 83 overall, number 7 in California, and he's got offers from everybody. So he committed in May, and that's a huge building block. But like you said, like that garage is really nice in Westwood, but it hasn't had any Lamborghinis in it in the 20 years I've been doing this. So like it's at a certain point you have to pick what you want to be. You're not going to compete financially with the team cross town, never mind the Bucks and the Wolverines in Penn State. So like, who are you going to be, UCLA? That's the existential question here.
And with a big quarterback commit, quarterbacks bring hope. Hope has been a theme of this podcast, and we certainly hope that you have enjoyed it. College Game Day on its way to Austin for Georgia and Texas. We can only hope that this colossal showdown will live up to the first two we've had this season between the Dogs and the Crimson Tide, and the Buckeyes and the Ducks this past weekend. We trust that it will. Thank you for listening to the podcast. Download this wherever you prefer to get your podcast, or better yet, subscribe so you never miss an episode.